Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for the next installment of Bespoke's spring webinar series. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Dan. I'm the COO here at Bespoke Education. I also have a lot of background in the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, just working on that with many students over my time here at Bespoke. I'm joined by Isaac Foster, our CEO, who's going to be doing the lion's share of the presentation. He's going to say a few words to introduce himself as well. But mostly, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. We're so excited to have you here. This has been a great series this spring, really trying to get some good, simple information out there about these topics that everyone cares about. There are a lot of questions swirling around. So we're just trying to deliver some simple stuff that you can use to make your decisions most effectively going forward. So Isaac, why don't you say a few words about yourself? I'll say a few words about Bespoke, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy that you're here. My name is Isaac Foster. I'm Bespoke's CEO. I've been with Bespoke for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a middle school teacher in East Harlem. And then I worked for Kaplan Test Prep in Paris for 4 years, running the team of teachers there. So Dan and I have both been doing test prep and related subjects for 15 years. So that means we've got 30 years of experience between the two of us. And we really are just fascinated by these tests. We enjoy thinking about them, talking about them, sharing our information, demystifying them so that students and parents feel empowered in their engagement with this. So we hope that we're able to share some practical and relevant information with you tonight to help you start your journey.
Great. So for those of you who don't know Bespoke, I'm just going to take a minute or two to walk through some of the things that Bespoke does. We are a full service educational company that supports students at any point in their educational journey. We've worked with students as young as second or third grade and as old as 40 years old who are revisiting the GRE or GMAT for entry into grad school. So really throughout, we have a lot of things to offer, a lot of ways to help. One big thing we're looking at now, especially in the COVID moment, is our general tutoring services that are not just for test prep, that are the academic support, the academic coaching, essay support, academic advising, what classes should I take, that sort of thing. We have a lot of years of expertise on really helping students become great students, not just become really good at the standardized tests. We also do classes, our own classes, boot camps, summer intensives, that sort of thing. What some people don't know is that we also partner with schools. We do classes on the SAT or ACT or biology or SAT fundamentals with many schools in the region. Some of that information is on our website, or if you'd like to learn more about those kinds of partnerships and if they're right for your school, please be in touch. We do mock testing. This is a big piece of preparing for the tests. You've got to practice it as it lies. And that's part of really getting ready for these tests, as we're going to discuss today. So a mock testing environment that replicates the testing environment, which is what we've tried to create, is really essential to that. We do both in person on our Upper West, Upper East Side, and our Bronxville locations. And then we also do online or remote mock testing, which, as you can understand, has become a more popular option in the last year. And that is an industry leader. We have outside tutors and even outside tutoring companies sending their students to us for that service. So please consider that going forward. Something people don't know about Bespoke is that we are also significantly involved in pro bono work. We do free one-on-one tutoring for deserving students, and a lot of our classes and programs in schools are in partnership with scholarship students to make sure that they have access to the tutoring that their peers in those schools do. We are also in the process of becoming certified as a B Corp in order to more fully live or demonstrate the values that we care about, which are equity and access in education. So if you want to know more about that as well, please be in touch. And lastly, most importantly for today, we do a lot of test prep tutoring. As Isaac said, he and I have done a great deal of this, and Bespoke's tutors as well, of just This has been I'd say the heart of the company for a long time because we're so familiar with it. We've written tests, we run this mock testing program. We've really tried to understand these tests and how they work and how to help students who are coming to these tests from all places. Students who are experts and just looking for that last a little gain, or students who have no exposure to these tests or even no exposure to standardized testing whatsoever. We meet your student where they are. We work with them to help them get where they want to be. So Isaac's going to take it away. We've got a great presentation. We're going to talk about it. A couple of notes. Please put your questions in the Q&A. That way, some of our fellow attendees can see them, and we'll bring them into the discussion. You can, of course, message us in the chat if you would like, but the Q&A is a little more public for making those questions part of the conversation. We do have a poll, which is very simple. As you'll see, we just brought it up. And if you can answer that, that would be helpful. It's going to help us just tune things a little bit as today proceeds. And once you've finished it, please close the window so you can see us and see the presentation. Isaac, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. So what you'll be able to see momentarily is a slide presentation, and we will make this presentation available to you. So I don't want the participants to think that you have to frantically write things down. And I would say even more broadly, our objective tonight when we're talking about the SAT and the ACT is really to empower families to have an impression of these tests vis-a-vis their students. So we're going to be talking about their similarities, we're going to be talking about their differences, and we're going to show you some sample problems that really enliven what those similarities and differences are. But this is really about just having a sense of these tests. This is a long process where the students can really become experts. This can be a first step, but we do think of it as a process. And tonight's really just about getting a shared common understanding. Okay, so we're seeing that there's mostly 10th graders here. That's great because this is a great time to begin this process. There are students from other grades here, and we'll certainly touch on what you can be doing. But I would say even more broadly, these are standardized tests, but no one goes through these exactly the same way. So we're hoping that if you're new to us, that this is a jumping off point to start conversations about your particular student. And if you've done work with us before, we hope that this is a continuous process of getting advice that we think is specific to your kid, so we can build a plan that makes sense for everything that you're trying to accomplish. So I first just want to situate the tests into a variety of elements in the college admissions process. They're not number one. They're there and they're important and they're relevant, even with everything that we've seen in the last year surrounding COVID. But I do think that it's important to underline that grades in school are the number one criteria for admissions. That 4 years of academic curricular success is more important than 4 hours on a Saturday or Sunday. So we definitely have conversations with families of, hey, we're going to engage in a test prep program. Let's do it. Let's check in. How's everything going with schoolwork? Because if there's a moment where there's a big project or even a semester-long class that's taking up a lot of attention, let's make sure that we're paying attention to the thing that's going to move the overall college admissions process further and not be totally focused just on tests exclusively. So we do try to put it in partnership between what the student has to do for the school day and the things that the students are asked to do outside of the school day. As you'll see in a moment, there's a calendar of different test options. And so there's enough opportunities for students to take the test during the summer, for example, that if there's ever a moment where school work is starting to get a little bit more intensive and that we need to take a step back in the test prep process, that's fine. Let's re-up again in the summer or even in the fall. And we'll talk about those different scenarios. You know, SAT and ACTs are still a significant admissions criteria. Obviously, and I think it's relevant to talk about, a lot of things that happened in the last 14 months have impacted that, not done away with it entirely. Although there are school systems like the University of California system, which is saying, you know, we're no longer going to use those as criteria. But even many private and public colleges that have gone test optional have potentially only gone test optional for a short period of time. So for 10th graders and probably for 9th graders on this call, that process may be revised in the coming cycle or two. And even, and I know that we know that this is confusing for families, the question of test optionality is sort of difficult to parse. If it's test optional, does that mean me? Do I really have to take this? The way that we like to think about it is, if a college has a long-standing test optional policy, that's probably a continuity and continuation of what that policy is. If a college has recently arrived at test optionality, that may be an interpretation for the student or family to say, if I can put forth a great score that's going to help me stand out, it's going to help me in my overall application. So I think it can be very confusing for families to interpret what recent test optionality means. The way that we're thinking about it is, if it's test optional and you're in the situation of putting forth a really great score, it's going to help your application.
It's worth noting,
Dan, please.
It's worth noting that this is actually the same slide that we've had in this presentation for several years, since before coronavirus. And some families have asked us, has this order changed? Is it still in this order? And from everyone who we know, who are our college advisors and our contacts in college admissions offices and in college advising offices in the schools, the answer is yes, that the tests are still there, they're still present. They're not going to be disappearing in the next year. And so this is probably going to be a piece of your work. And not to sound the bell of alarm too much, but as you may have seen from some numbers coming out of colleges for their admissions, because many test scores were waived, the test score requirements were waived this last year, the number of applicants went up dramatically. And in relation to that, the number or the percentage of admitted applicants went down dramatically. And so this is a long way of saying that just because the requirements are shifting does not mean that the schools have become any less competitive. So that's something to consider. What is going to set you apart could be any one of these pieces, but if the SAT or the ACT is a place where you can make some progress and some good contributions, then go for it.
Thanks, Dan. And I think that dovetails nicely with what the next criteria is, which is college essays. And I would say even more broadly, I mean, it's something that we're eager to help students with, both the brainstorming and the drafting of the college essays, but also more broadly, the college advising. And then that really gives us an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with students and families of saying, hey, let's talk about your profile. Let's talk about the colleges that you're interested in. And then let's think about how testing fits into that. The college essays really are the only time that students get to speak directly to colleges. And so it's important that they're able to share something pertinent about their interest in the colleges. Absolutely, for sophomores on the call, if you're starting to think about touring, if that's in person or virtual touring, attending events at your high school where college reps are coming, by all means, do all of those things. And take notes. When you write down some of the salient things that you hear during those presentations, it's going to make it so much easier when you have to craft an argument about why you want to attend a particular school. Teacher recommendations are still very important. What we're really seeing is the teacher recommendations that make the most impact are when the teacher can speak to how the student contributed to a successful learning environment. It's not just the student's individual academic success. That may have been more relevant in past years, but given everything that's going on, the students who are helping their peers and even their teacher, helping them with Zoom, helping them with the Google Classroom, all of the things that students and now teachers are having to navigate, contributing to this being a successful academic experience, despite everything, that's a way for students to stand out. And for students, don't be afraid of asking a teacher with whom you got to be in the class. As long as you worked hard and you pushed yourself and you supported your peers, that's going to be more meaningful than in a class where you sailed to an A and didn't really show some of that grit or stick-with-itness. Extracurricular activities are tough to come by these days. A lot of things have been impacted. Anticipated things that you wanted to do last summer or might want to do this coming summer, to say nothing of the school year, have been curtailed or changed. At the same time, don't give up. There really are a lot of opportunities to get involved online, if that's online peer tutoring or generating money for causes that you care about, gathering community energy around an issue. And also, I would say for 9th and 10th graders, as you're starting to explore clubs in your school, I start identifying something that you really care about, because colleges are looking for that sustained passion throughout, not just something that you showed up for senior year. And finally, about extracurriculars, don't worry so much about whether you have a leadership position in the club. It's not about whether you're president or vice president. It's more important that you show up and that you're making an impact, and it's something that connects to you and that you care about. So we're going to divide the presentation into a few elements. We're going to give some overview about these two tests. We're going to get very specific and show some sample problems, and then we'll take a step back and talk about planning. Obviously, there's a lot of information that we're going to throw at you. I think, again, this is about impressions. This is about getting a sense of these tests rather than trying to achieve mastery or expertise. The thing I want to start with, so here we are in the spring. So for the sophomores on the call, we're talking to you. This is the time where you're taking initial looks at these tests. We're going to talk about the decision-making process between SAT and ACT in a moment, but this is really where the process can begin. In terms of when might I take my first official test, it might be as early as the fall or the winter of 11th grade. So we definitely have some students at Bespoke who are taking the tests in August, September, and October of their junior year. That's great. If that's when they're ready and that's when their mock tests are showing that they're at the level they want to be, fantastic. There's no need to get them out of the way that early, but if that's lining up with everything that you're trying to accomplish, great. Typically, students are taking first official SATs or ACTs in the spring of their junior year. So that's, as you can see from the calendar here, you do have a lot of options in terms of hitting different test dates throughout the academic year and even into the summer. And so it's typical for juniors to be taking it for the first time in the spring and potentially into the summer. As I said before, if spring junior year, if you're on that varsity team, or if you're doing an intensive internship, or if you're in some sort of big performance, maybe you're taking a step back in terms of your prep during the spring of junior year, and you're coming back to it in the fall between junior and senior year. There's still opportunities to take it. Yes, you have to be attentive to early application deadlines, which might limit you after October of senior year, but there's still a few, as you can see, late summer, early fall opportunities. Thing that I want to mention, as you can see in one of the bullet points, 2 official tests seems to be the right number for most kids. Sometimes you hit it on your first try, great. Sometimes you need 2 because that first experience, you're getting your nerves out, you're just continuing to get more familiar and increasing your expertise. That's great. And there are sometimes there's students that take it 3 times, and that's still a wonderful thing. We want to start having a conversation if this is a repeated process of more and more testing of, okay, you want to keep trying for these tests? Let's make sure everything else from the prior slide that is going to be a criteria for your college admissions is being taken care of before we invest more time and energy into the test prep process. So I do want to point out, just in terms of how we're going to engage with questions, we have some colleagues who are with us on the call who are going to be engaging in the chat for some things that we're not necessarily able to get to. We'll try to pick that back up at the end of the seminar. So what's that decision-making process look like? So I do want to emphasize that we really believe, despite the similarities between these tests, and you're going to see that they're, in many respects, they're quite similar. We do want you to decide. We want the students to specialize in one of these tests. And now that process doesn't have to happen overnight. I certainly don't think that at the end of this webinar, you're going to decide, well, I'm an SAT kid or I'm an ACT kid. That's not necessarily the point, but we do want to indicate that, yes, at some point you should choose. Well, what's that decision process look like? Sophomores, right now, if you haven't already, come and take an SAT practice test with us, and then a week or 10 days later, take an ACT practice test with us. Or you can do it at home, as long as Dan said, if it's under test-like conditions. If you want to do a remote mock test with us, that's great too. Or have a parent who's going to create the right testing environment, proctor your test. But the point is, let's get some data. And I think that this is especially important, especially for students who have a little bit of anxiety about the process. We see this all the time. That's perfectly normal. Let's get information, because that's going to help us make decisions rather than, oh, I don't feel ready. That's something we hear a lot from 10th graders. They don't feel ready to take a diagnostic. It's just a diagnostic. We're not trying to say, oh, well, this is what you got in the spring of 10th grade, so this is therefore what you're going to get on the test day. Let's just get a sense of, what did you feel about these two tests? How did you score? Let's have a conversation about your learning profile, which is going to be relevant, your enthusiasm about which of these feels better. And all of that's going to coalesce together as we start putting a plan into place. And the plan might be, hey, we're not going to do anything for the summer because you're going to camp and 10th grade was really challenging and we want to take a breather. But because we have that information, because we have that data, both quantitative, your score, and qualitative, the student's experience of the test, we can go into the summer feeling like we can disconnect and not worry about it because we have that information that has informed this plan. So the informed student in this case is the empowered student.
I think it's worth echoing something that Isaac said here, which is that a lot of people hesitate to take a first mock test or to take the second mock test after their first mock test because they say, oh, the first one was a diagnostic, but now I'm preparing, so I'm not ready yet. I don't know it all yet. And I've got to tell you, this is not the right way of approaching it. You're never going to be ready, 100% ready, because part of what these tests do is they put something new on it just because they want to see how you respond to something that hasn't been on the test before. So as much as possible, try to shift your mindset from this being a test that you can be 100% prepared and ready for to a mindset of, this is a test that I am familiar with, that I'm comfortable with, and on which I know how to proceed, even if I see something that's unfamiliar.
That's super important because the point is not that you're going to know how to do every single problem. The point is more, how comfortable and confident can you be in responding to unfamiliar information? And we're going to see that on several of the sample problems. So this is what the decision process looks like. Let's start talking about their similarities and differences. So as you may know, the SAT underwent a pretty significant revision 4 or 5 years ago. We suspect that part of the reasoning behind that decision was that the ACT, which for a lot of parents on this call, I imagine is a largely unfamiliar test, the ACT had actually overtaken the SAT in terms of number of test takers nationally. There are a few reasons for that. And so we suspect that the SAT responded to that by saying, well, we've got to go through a revision. And the result of the revision, as you'll see in some of the sample problems, was that it started looking a lot more like the ACT. Since then, the SAT now is once more the most popular test nationwide, but the tests have really converged. And you can see that from the bullet points here, they're testing grammar. They call it something a little bit different. The ACT calls it English, SAT calls it writing and language, but it's testing grammar. It's testing reading comp. They're both called reading in that case. And they are testing math in multiple choice contexts. There's some different flavors of how that appears, but they're both testing math. So the content is very similar across both tests. The presentation of that content is going to be a significant difference, which we'll talk about in a moment. I do also want to point out, because this is a difference between the SAT and its prior format, there's no longer a wrong answer penalty on the SAT. And that's true on both questions where you pick from one of the multiple choices, and also on the SAT, there's a question type in which the student has to bubble in their own answer. Even on those, there's no penalty for a wrong answer. So one way of taking away from this is you got to put an answer for everything. You have to put an answer for everything because there's no penalty for leaving it blank. And that's going to be true both on your initial diagnostic tests, your mock tests, and on the real tests. Leave nothing blank. Let's start talking about the differences, because even now, at the end of this slide, for some students and some families, these differences might start nudging you in one direction or another. And what the most salient difference between the two is that the SAT is going to give the student more time per question on equivalent question types. And we'll see a chart that shows that in a moment. So already, time. These are both time tests, yes. And there are students on this call that have more or less experience with timed multiple choice tests. But there are some students, for many reasons, who are very comfortable blazing through a multiple choice test with a high level of attention to detail and a high level of accuracy. And that's great. There are some students that really prefer to take a little bit more time and try different techniques and read the question a couple times and think about it. And the ACT is going to start privileging that first group of kids, the rapid kids that can get through a lot in a little bit of time. And the SAT is going to be a little bit more welcoming for the kids that like to think about it, that like to take a little bit more time. And we're going to see even some problem types that exemplify why that's the case. So timing is going to be a significant factor between the two of these. Another significant factor, and Dan can speak to this in a moment, is the difference of how SAT and ACT treat math. Dan, can you speak to this, please?
Yes, thanks, Isaac. And we're going to get to this more in depth. So one question from Monday, which was, Tuesday, which was a great question, was what about the actual math content? How does that track with the coursework that my student is taking or that I'm taking in high school? And the two tests are very comparable in terms of the actual math topics that are presented on the tests. They are weighted heavily towards geometry, algebra 1, and trigonometry, with some spicy items from more advanced topics in math. Both tests have sort of fancy phrases for that. Passport to Advanced Math is a choice one from the SAT, but those topics are really not a very big piece of the test. So typically a student who is on a fairly regular math course of study will be ready to take this test by the fall/middle of their junior year. Depending on their coursework, they may have had less or more exposure to some of those other topics, the advanced topics in math. The other item, which we'll see more in a moment, has to do with sort of reading comprehension and how it overlaps with math skill. And I think that's best to talk about when we actually get to look at the math problems themselves.
Thanks, Dan. Another way of thinking about this, and the ACT is going to be broad in terms of its math, but quite shallow, as we'll see in a moment. The SAT is a little bit narrower, but the depth of complexity and understanding that it demands of the students is going to be deeper. And we'll see how that also relates to the time that it takes to do these questions. Data analysis is pertinent on both tests, but the ACT concentrates it in one section, and it's diffused throughout the SAT. The SAT has a really interesting reading comprehension question style, which we'll see in a moment. And you may have heard recently the SAT eliminated its essay. Actually, they did that at the same time that they eliminated the subject tests. So the essay only remains on the ACT. The essay, again, this is not a college essay. We're just talking about the essay of the ACT. It doesn't typically tend to be a significant admissions factor. But if your college you're applying to still requires the writing section and you have to do it, it behooves you to do well on it because every little bit counts when you're submitting data for consideration. So this slide, I think, really highlights the difference in timing. For every equivalent question type, the SAT is going to give students more time, and sometimes a lot more time. We are not trying to suggest that on that basis alone, you're going to make a decision between these tests. There are reasons that the SAT is giving you more time. But I do think that it is relevant for many students to be thinking, okay, if I'm going to work on the ACT, a thing that I'm going to have to work on is high speed while maintaining high accuracy. That's a challenge. And so if you commit to that, that's a thing that you will be working on. Some students don't want to have to work on that. And then the SAT might be a better fit. There will be other challenges in that case that they would have to commit to working on. So just to talk a little bit about content, we're going to move through this and then the equivalent SAT slide to allow us to talk a little bit more about the scores. As you can see on the ACT, it's divided into these 4 standard sections. They always come in the same order. You only get one shot at each. So you only have one shot at English grammar. You only have one shot at math, one shot at reading, one shot at science. And they're divided into these different subsections. The essay is, of course, if you take it, coming later. Let's talk about the score. The score of the ACT is calculated by assigning a score to each of these subtests or subsections. So you get a score out of 36 for English, and you get a score out of 36 for math, etc. The overall, or what's called the composite score, is the result of an average of these 4 subsection scores rounded up. So if you come away with a 32.5, then what shows on your score report is a 33, and that's also what's sent to college. So that's just trying to give you a sense of what scores are. Dan's going to talk a little bit about putting those scores into context.
Yeah, so a lot of the questions we get are along the lines of what score do I need to get? And obviously, that's a very hard question to answer. We try to learn about the student and learn about the schools that they're heading for. But one big piece that we make sure to introduce to the conversation is the idea of percentiles and how that number connects to these actual scores that you're looking at here. And what a percentile is, in a very sort of simple way of explaining it, is how your score compares to all the other students who are taking that test. So for example, you might get a 32 out of 36, but if everybody else got a 32 out of 36, then that's not actually a very impressive score. So when you get your score report, you also receive the percentile numbers. And I think it's worth getting into the details with the ACT here, just to give you a sense of how these numbers relate to the population at large. So, and I'm consulting this on my phone. I apologize for looking down, but I have it pulled up right here. A 36 is a 100th percentile score, which basically means there are very few people who are getting that score, because you are essentially at the very top of the 100% of students taking that test. If we go down 1 point to a 35 average, you're in the 99th percentile. So 1% of students are doing better than you with a grade of 35. Now, here's a cool thing. If you go down to a 34, you are still in the 99th percentile, which means that as far as percentiles go, a 34 and a 35 are interchangeable. If we go down one more to a 33, you're in the 98th percentile. So there's a lot of room at the top for these very high performers. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. One way, which is valid, is that if you've got a 34, 35, that difference is not removing you from any college admissions applicant pool, because the admissions advisors understand that there's very little concrete difference between those two scores. Now, what that means is they're going to look at other pieces of your application to distinguish between those two students. So some people might say, well, does it really matter then if I get a 33, 34, 35? By that token, probably not. But I think what we say in response to that is, if you have a way forward in your prep and in your process towards those higher scores, then go for it. But if you're finding that getting that last point, that last 2 points is extremely stubborn, then usually there's probably a more productive way to spend that time, whether it's moving a grade in school from a B+ to an A-, or from a B- to a B+. That sort of effort might be a lot more meaningful for your transcript and for your ultimate application.
Thanks, Dan. And again, like anything else, as I said, these are standardized tests, but it's so dependent on the student's specific criteria and background. So we really invite to have conversations, even when we start the prep process of, let's look at diagnostic scores. Let's talk about colleges that you have in mind. Let's describe different paths forward. Let's build a plan that suits your student, rather than thinking, well, I'm seeing, well, Dan's going to talk a little bit about what colleges publish, but rather than orient it around it, what it seems like a class profile on a college website is saying. On the SAT side, so this is the breakdown here. Again, it's testing similar content. So there's reading comprehension, there's grammar, which they call writing and language, and there's math. I just want to point out one thing about the structure of the SAT relative to the ACT. First thing that the student has to do on the SAT is 65 minutes of reading. That is a lot of reading. There are very few opportunities for students in their typical academic life to do 65 minutes of nonstop reading. So we're going to talk about, how do you develop your reading endurance? How do you develop your general testing endurance, potentially by doing mock tests as well as your homework? Because this by itself, even if you're a very successful reader, you've got to do it for 65 minutes with a high level of attention and accuracy. So we're going to have to think about, it's not just how well do you engage on a single question or a single passage. You've got to get through the entirety of that section. In terms of scores on the SAT, so instead of an average like it is on the ACT, it's a sum. So the SAT was briefly out of 2,400. It's back to being out of 1,600. And so there's a verbal piece of that, which is the reading and the writing and language, the grammar, and a math piece. And so you get a score out of 800 and a score out of 800, and that's combined to give you your total 1600 score. So Dan's going to talk a little bit more about a different way of thinking about scores now.
Yeah. So again, this question, what score do I need to get? And another response and another piece of the conversation that we want to introduce is, where are you headed? And this doesn't mean that you've got to know exactly what school you want to go to and what's your dream school in 9th grade or 10th grade, because we understand that's not reasonable and that's not where you're thinking. But as far as starting to figure it out, something that is fairly easy to find online is what's called the interquartile range of accepted students at pretty much any college which accepts these tests. And what that number is looking at all the students who got in a given year, and they line up their test scores, and then they tell you what that middle 50% of the students who got in got. Now, what that means is that 25% of accepted students got higher than that, and 25% of accepted students got lower than that. But if you look at that interquartile range, that middle 50, that's going to give you a pretty good sense of what kind of score that college is looking for. And if you say, wow, that's high or that's low, or let me take my first mock test and then see how my number compares to that, that's going to start to give you a sense of what is sort of a reasonable place to start thinking about admission, or a stretch admission, or a safety admission.
Thanks, Dan. So now let's pivot and start talking about some other aspects of how this fits together. Some terms that you may have heard of: score choice and super score, and what the relevant implications of these two elements are. So this is what score choice means. The data of your tests belongs to the student. So both the College Board and the ACT have policies in place whereby if you take a test, no one needs to know about it. Meaning you cannot be obliged, or no one will compel the SAT or the ACT to send your scores without your consent. Okay, sounds good. Another phenomenon is that colleges, and even now the ACT is doing it for you on their score report, will do something called super scoring. So because you can take the tests multiple times, what colleges will do when they receive the scores is that they'll say, okay, the student took the test twice. I'm going to take the student's best English score from the ACT, so that means February, but the student did even better in math from the April test, so I'm going to put math from April, and then they did even better in June on reading, so I'm going to take that June score, and instead of only assigning the scores from one test date, the colleges have assembled it from the combination of all official tests. So that's in the student's favor as well, which is, okay, I can take the test multiple times. No one needs to know about it. But if I do divulge that I've taken it multiple times, then they're going to build or cobble together a better score than what I ultimately would have done on one test by itself. But there are a handful of schools, and Yale, Georgetown come to mind. There's a handful of schools which oblige their applicants to send all of their test results, not just the ones that necessarily the students are happy about or that want to share in order to build something like a super score. There may have been an official test that a student took where they really didn't perform to the best of their ability for a lot of different reasons. And maybe it would have been better that they didn't take it in order not to have that risk of having to be compelled to send it. So where does this leave us? Which is, you own your test results, except some colleges insist on you sending them. The way that we advise students to navigate this landscape is take official tests when you feel ready to get a score that you're going to be happy about, that you could be happy or willing for a college to examine. And again, I think that this is more for the students who are even thinking or considering schools that might compel them to send their scores, but it's relevant enough that you don't want to be in a situation where you've taken the test officially 5 or 6 times. And yes, your super score is great because you hit all the different marks on the combination of all those tests. But then the college is going to look at that and say, well, why did the student take 5 times to do this? One, doesn't the student have something else that they could be doing? Or two, does this really demonstrate the student's academic excellence? So again, trying to think of take tests when you're ready, let the mock test data indicate when that is.
This is a good time to answer a question that came up in the Q&A here. Someone commented about students, even at a very ambitious academic school, still taking the SAT in the fall of their senior year. And so why start in the fall of your junior year? And there's a lot of validity to that. You don't want to be prepping for this test for a year plus. Some students do if they find that they're running into trouble getting the score that they want. But another way to think about that is that you don't want to be going through 9-10 months sort of wondering trepidatiously what is going to happen when I begin my SAT or my ACT prep. So what we advise is that you start this time, the spring of sophomore year, somewhere between sophomore and junior year, by taking these practice tests, because then you're going to have a baseline and you're going to have an idea of where you are. And I've had some students who are rare, I will say that freely, who do great. They do a couple sessions and they take it fall of their junior year and then they're done. That's unusual, but at least they know that they're in that ballpark when they start working on it that summer before their junior year. Some other students take that practice test and they say, all right, this is in decent shape. I'm going to start in January of my junior year, because that's when I'm going to be a little bit less busy and that makes more sense to me. But at least then you have a plan. And I think what we're advocating for is make the plan so you can rest a little bit easier at night. It really helps.
Thanks, Dan. Let's start looking specifically about the makeup, the similarities and differences between these two tests. So here's what ACT English looks like. You have an essay on the left and you have opportunities to correct that essay on the right. So this is a very similar activity that students might do in their English class of correcting their partner's work. You can see that it's a combination of some purely grammatical or even punctuation marks. So that semicolon usage is going to be an important success factor for students here. But not only grammar and punctuation, but also potentially style or rhetoric. You can see that number 11 is saying, well, where should paragraph 4 be placed? That's not about grammar, but that's just, does the essay cohere? Does it make sense? So some things to comment about success factors here. A lot of students haven't necessarily taken a grammar class, or if they did, it might have been an elementary school activity. So there's definitely going to be some reminders about subject-verb agreement or pronouns or modifiers. That stuff tends to come fairly quickly to students. This is not the most difficult section typically for students, but there really are some rules to remind the student of fairly quickly. And then you can see that that repeated exposure to this is going to bring the student reward. Remember how I said that the SAT underwent a revision and started looking a little bit like the ACT? So here you can see it's quite similar. You have an essay on the left and you have answer choices on the right that can potentially change or modify something in the essay. There's a little bit of vocab from here on the SAT, nothing like the vocab that the SAT had emphasized before, but sometimes there's word choice. What's the right word for this passage or this moment? But again, very similarly, we're talking about grammar rules, talking about punctuation, we're talking about rhetorical success. Is the author delivering the idea successfully? Again, typically, these equivalent sections are not the thing that causes the students the most struggle. And also, as you can see, they're not a big decision factor between the two of them because they're so similar. That's not the same case with math. So we've spent a good amount of time already talking about math. Let's look specifically about how that appears. Here's a typical but not exhaustive example of ACT math. So we're not trying to suggest that all ACT math looks like this, but this is certainly capturing the flavor of what a lot of ACT math looks like. Which of the following is a value of x that satisfies log-based x of 36 equals 2? So there are some 10th graders on the call that should be familiar enough with this, or at least could take a good guess. And the more to the point, if you know your log rules, you're probably already done. You already know that, oh, this is asking x to the second power equals 36. Oh, so now I'm solving for x at 6. Done. If you know your log rules, and if you're an employee that high attention to detail, you already have the answer and you're moving on to the next problem. That's great. Well, if you don't know your log rules, it's very hard to engage with this problem. There's no unraveling or unlocking. There's no strategy really to apply here. We're going to spend a good amount of time later in the seminar talking about question triage and how to apportion your time relative to the problem that's in front of you. So that's going to be an important success factor. So again, remember how I said ACT, very broad, but quite shallow. Here it's, as Dan likes to say, this is almost more like a math vocab test. Do you know what a log is? Well, here's your opportunity for having that reward. And if you know it, great. If you don't know it, better to guess and move on. Now, I want to contrast that. Even just the visual experience of this is what we think of as a typical SAT question. So again, not exhaustive, not all SAT questions are like this, but enough are that we think that this is emblematic of this test. It doesn't even look like a math problem. It looks like a reading comprehension text. So even the student's experience of this is going to be quite different. Kathy's a repair technician. Each week she receives a batch of phones that need repairs. The number of phones that she has left to fix at the end of each day can be estimated with the equation P equals 108 minus 23D, where P is the number of phones left and D is the number of days she's worked that week. What is the meaning of the value 108 of this equation? So first of all, look at the answer choices. They're not even numbers because it's asking about what is the meaning of this thing. So again, you can see, remember how I told you, or we told you, the SAT is going to give students more time. Well, this is why. It's not because you get more time and the problems are the same. You get more time because you have to wade through it. And not only do you have to wade through it, you could argue this isn't even really a math problem in the way that you're calculating something, but it is getting at a higher level, as Dan was saying, a higher level understanding of the math, which is, do you understand the elements of the equation that are being built? Do you understand their roles and what purpose that they serve? And for the student that does, for the student that recognizes, okay, pretty straightforward algebra expression, 108, we can think of as the y-intercept. In other words, it's the starting point. For that student, it's as easy to recognize, oh, well, then that must mean the number of phones that she starts with at the beginning of the week. Fine. But a few things to keep in mind. Very strong math students sometimes get frustrated with this because it's activating more their reading skills than their calculating skills. So for the strong math students on the call who are less eager readers, reading comprehension is still going to be relevant here. And so again, we're going to talk really about distinguishing important and unimportant information when you're dealing with math questions. That is really a significant success factor here. To move on to the other sections, so ACT reading. This is just one passage or one kind of passage that you'll have to deal with. There are 4 passages in ACT reading. They all look like this, 250, 300 words of different types of content. And then you have 10 questions about each passage. So that's 4 passages, 40 questions. Each passage, that is to say, passage plus 10 questions, the student has to do in 8.5 minutes, which is not a lot of time. But there is good news. And the good news is that the context for this is quite different. This is not a circumstance in which you have to memorize. This is not a circumstance in which you have to connect this to other works of literature that you have read or write a long form essay about it. This is about, can you get through it quickly? Can you remember where stuff was? Can you take some quick notes and go find the information as it's asked of you with each of these questions? I think something that's really important, and we're going to see this on reading, and we're going to see it on ACT Science in a few moments. The answer is in the passage. It has to be, because it's not about what you've already read. It's not activating whether you've read certain works of literature, and if you remember that. It's about, can you find the relevant information that proves your answer choice right now? And so I would even say for successful readers, so before we were talking about successful math students and how you have to change some of your habits or techniques. For successful readers, we talk about reading to learn. Don't try to learn this. This is not about how well you learn the content that's in this passage. It's about, can you recognize the framework or the structure? Can you remember where stuff is? And can you go back and find it when they ask you to find it? So for successful readers who engage with texts in a certain way, this is a different tool for a different task. Now, SAT reading is quite similar. I mean, there's a reading passage. This is not all of it. This is just an excerpt. But you have a little bit more time. So I think that the reading is relevant in terms of the time differential, but also there's a very interesting question type, and I want to highlight 13 and 14 here. So 13 is a straightforward reading comprehension question. Look at 14. Which choice provides the best evidence to the answer to the previous question? So not only does the student have to answer number 13, but then they have to prove it with answering number 14. Well, the good news is that, remember how I said it's got to be in the passage. So the successful SAT readers have already found the evidence to support number 13. And so 14 is a bonus. You get 2 points for answering one question. On the other hand, for the student that had to guess on 13, the student also has to guess on 14. And so the SAT has that kind of double bonus or double penalty, depending on how you want to look at it. It's not a significant distinction between the two tests, but this relationship is only present on the SAT. The ACT does not have this. I do also want to point out, remember how I said that data analysis is diffuse within the SAT and focused in the ACT? Yeah, you have to deal with charts and graphs in the middle of an SAT reading passage, and that can be a little bit distracting for some students. It's something to prepare for and something to keep in mind. If you've heard anything about ACT, you may have heard about ACT science and its relative difficulty. And it's true, it's difficult, but not necessarily for the reasons that people think. You can see there's a lot of scientific information on the left. This is a sort of similar setup to what we saw with reading comp. There's an experiment or some experimental data on the left, and then some pertinent questions about it on the right. But here's the thing. It's not about how good of a biology student you were. It's not about how well you're doing in chemistry this year or how well you'll do in physics next year. It's about recognizing trends of data and finding the relative information in the passage. It is helpful, yes, to understand the scientific method. How do scientists come up with hypotheses and conclusions, and how does data help them do that? But it's more important to be able to just find stuff, go and find the information. There are many occasions in which you can get the answer right, even if you don't know or don't have that scientific background. Let's demonstrate that. So if we see in 35, for example, according to experiment 1, as the molarity of sodium thiosulfate. So the passage will have already defined that sodium thiosulfate must be this Na2S2O3. As the molarity increases, okay, and M, as students will either remember or will also be defined in the passage as that capital M. As it increases, the time it takes to react, so reaction time is the y-axis there. As the molarity increases, the time it takes to react decreases. That's it. That's all you have to do. That's all the student is responsible for in that question type. And I think that that's relevant, especially for students who are already thinking, I have struggled with science, where I don't think of myself as a successful science student. Therefore, I'm not going to take the ACT because I've heard that it has a science section. I hope, and again, this is not the entirety of the ACT science section, but I hope looking at a question like this empowers the students to think, wait a second, I'm a good reader. I'm a reasonable person. I can understand charts, data, and graphs. Let me try engaging with the ACT on those terms rather than thinking of myself as a successful science student or not. Let's pivot and talk about, okay, now that you have all this information, what do you do with it? And we're in the final few minutes of our presentation. We'll talk about some of this planning, and either we have answered your questions throughout. We'll try to take a couple minutes to answer some questions, and of course, we welcome your follow-up after the presentation. It is important, as we said, to as much as possible, you got to maintain your academic excellence in your classes while you're engaging with this kind of test material. But we do encourage you to make this a part of your academic life, and there's many ways to do it. You can take a one-on-one tutoring with us. You can take a group class with us or through a school partner if you're enrolled in one of those schools. There are many students who prepare for this on their own or with a friend. I think that the commonality for all of this is that there's structure, is that this is really something that, you know, if you don't feel like doing it, you put it off, you're not necessarily going to see the gains. If there's a structure, that's a tutor or a friend or a class, a mentor who is guiding you through this and encouraging you to show up for it, that's really where you're going to see the gains. It's important to be patient. I'm talking to the parents as much as I am to the students here. There's going to be some jumps, and then there's going to be some plateaus. That's normal. We see that all the time. To be patient with yourself, students, and to be patient with your students, parents, really contributes to overall success in this project. Some things that we would work on in a test prep class. Some things that we've mentioned, but to talk about it a little bit more. Notice, these tests, I hope you've got the feeling so far, they're not like tests in school. One way that they're not like tests in school is that the easy problems and the hard problems are worth the same number of points. And so that's going to be really important just in terms of recognizing, do I know how to do this problem? Is this a good idea for me to engage in this problem, or might I be better served trying a different problem and coming back to it? How are you going to get through the sections on time? And even more importantly, do you have a sense of what 1 minute feels like? Do you know what 5 minutes feels like? So you're not looking at the watch or the clock after every problem. Do you want to do questions like your math teacher in school would have you do it? Or do you want to use a shortcut that's pertinent because this is a multiple choice test? These are questions that each student has to ask themselves as they encounter every question. And then, as we said, is this a good use of your time to work on this question right now? Or might you be better served skipping number 5, which is hard for kids to do because it's there and it feels like it should be easy because it's the beginning of the section? No, go do 6, 7, 8, 9, gather those points, and then come back and do number 5. Let's not let number 5 overly influence how the rest of the section is going to go. Some considerations in terms of regular practice and mock testing. I think that a 25-minute practice 4 to 5 times a week is both achievable and also will make an impact if the student is bringing focus and attention while the student is working in those 25 minutes. It's like a language or a sport. High-performing athletes and high-performing musicians, performers of various kinds, linguists, you can't get better at it just by doing it for 4 hours on a Sunday. It's really about making it a consistent part of your academic life. And that's where we see the gains, is that if there's habits, if there's opportunities to keep practicing and keep this exposure in front of these different questions, that's really where we see the gains. We recommend taking mock tests every 3 to 4 weeks. And so if we're talking about a 5 to 8 month prep timeline, that's going to get you 5 to 8 mock tests before your first official mock test. And then there's a lot of value for taking mock tests, some of which we've talked about, but the endurance piece, making sure that you have an opportunity to practice this in a real time environment. And then it feels good for the student. You can see the score go up because you've been working hard, and you get into this beneficial cycle of, I want to keep coming back to this because I see the fruits of my labor. That's really one of the positive things about standardized tests, is that they are so numeric. You can see the results of your efforts. So what about for the students who are before 10th grade? For 9th graders, or if there's any siblings that are on the call, a lot of reading. Get books in your hands, magazines, unfamiliar sources, diverse materials as much as possible. I think that's point number 1. And then point number 2, stay up in your math class, because it's cumulative. And not only the knowledge that you're gaining now, but the way that you feel about math and your confidence that's going to come over these next couple of years is going to be important. These other academic skills are going to be crucial, making sure that you're apportioning your time, that you're aware that you're learning how to ask for help if you need it, and you have resources that you can draw on. And for 9th graders or for younger, take a practice SSAT, take a practice IC, especially for students, as Dan mentioned. We have a lot of students in the New York area who are in schools for whom multiple choice testing is not a part of their curriculum. And so if you arrive in 11th grade and the SAT is the first exposure for multiple choice testing, it can be a shock. Take an SSAT, take an IC practice test with us. No one needs to know about those results. And it's a low stakes or a no stakes opportunity to get more comfortable with the testing format before you encounter these more advanced tests. What we want to conclude with, at least in the prepared remarks that we have, and we know we're also at 7:30, so some people are going to leave us. It's going to be okay. Your kids are great. They've worked so hard. They have weathered an impossible period, and they've gotten through it. Dan and I have been doing this for a long time, and we really believe that test prep, when it's done right in a caring and compassionate way, where it's putting the student first, it can be an opportunity for the student to thrive and grow and push themselves and discover talents or abilities, perseverance that they didn't necessarily know that they have. So we'd be honored to be a part of your team as you engage with this. We hope that this is a stepping stone for ongoing conversations as we position ourselves to serve you and your students with their specific needs. So for those of you who've got to run, thanks for coming, and we're going to pause here. We're going to take a few questions.
Great. We actually have one question about extra time and learning differences. And I think we have a minute or two there to get into it. The question was how a student who has learning differences or has the extra time accommodation starts their preparation and spaces out their tests and selects their actual test dates. This is a big question. I've also messaged you that we'll follow up individually about this, but I think we can get to a few pieces of it. One of the items is that the two tests approach the extra time accommodations slightly differently. What both tests do, however, is they both have a preference for a pretty extensive paper trail backing up the students' learning differences or accommodations, that is part of what you as a parent or as a family are going to send to the test when you are requesting that extra time. Now, one sort of wrinkle is that for the College Board, the company that runs the SAT, you apply for extra time once, and if you are granted it, you are then granted it on every single time you go to take the SAT. For the ACT, you have to apply for your accommodations on a per test basis. Now, once you have applied for it and been accepted once, you are very likely to get accepted for it a second or a third time. But that's this weird wrinkle where you have to register for a test and then apply for the accommodations for that test. Now, what we can say is that depending on the learning difference, and obviously there is a great deal of difference itself within that term, but depending on the learning difference, this work can take much longer, or it can actually not be affected very much. So I would say, as far as getting your start, it's a similar timeline. Sophomore year, end of sophomore year, summer between sophomore and junior year is a great time to start those practice tests. But then you do a first session or two, try to get some improvement, and then see how much the score moves. Because I think that's, for you, the really meaningful data. It's going to say, do we have traction? Can we move forward? Or is that actual progress going to take more time than we had thought? And that's probably going to help you get the best sense of how long this will take for my student. One element of accommodations to consider is there are some that are over multiple days. Like they break the test in two and you take half on Saturday and half on Sunday. For that kind of accommodation, I think you can realistically imagine that the student is probably going to be taking fewer mock tests because it is more of a production and an investment of time to sit for any individual mock test. For more, we're going to reach out to you after this. Thank you for that question. I think that may be it from what I'm seeing. Isaac, thank you. And really thank all of you. Thank our attendees. Thank you, Maya and Sarah, for supporting us here. Thanks for joining us. We will be sharing a recording of this afterwards in a day or two, so please look forward to that. And please share it. We're really trying to get this information out there. We realize there's so many questions floating around, so many rumors, so many ideas of when or where or how we're supposed to start this work. So we're really coming at this from a mindset of trying to share some useful information, whether or not you decide to tutor with us. Obviously, we would love that, but there's a real value in just this piece of the work, trying to answer things clearly. And call us. Those conversations are free and they're involved, and we really enjoy them, just getting the good word out there.